Hi guys, here we are back for The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, the last chapter, chapter 17. So if you remember, chapter 16 ended with Aslan and everybody who was freed, all the stone statues that were at the witch's palace that Aslan freed, and all of them now have gone to find the battle against the witch. And as we find it, Aslan and the witch are in a battle. And we're going to see now what happens in the rest of this story. Chapter 17, The Hunting of the White Stag. The battle was all over a few minutes after their arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in their first charge of Aslan and his companions, and when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took to flight. The next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Aslan were shaking hands. It was strange to her to see Peter looking as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed much older. "It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan," Peter was saying. "We'd have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch was turning our troops into stone right and left, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through 3 ogres to where she was just turning one of your leopards into a statue, and when he reached her, he had sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly, and simply getting made a statue himself for his pains. That was the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have some chance, if we hadn't lost so many already. He was terribly wounded. We must go and see him." They found Edmund in charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood. His mouth was open, and his face a nasty green color. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then almost for the first time Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been given her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much that she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed it in the end and poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are other people wounded," said Aslan, while she was still looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any result. "Yes, I know," said Lucy crossly. "Wait a minute." "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a graver voice, "others also are at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund?" "I'm sorry, Aslan," said Lucy, getting up and going with him, and for the next half hour they were busy, she attending to the wounded while he restored those who had been turned into stone. When at last she was free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had seen him look, for ages, in fact ever since his first term at that horrid school, which was where he had begun to go wrong. He had become his old, real self again, and could look you in the face, and there on the field of battle Aslan made him a knight. "Does he know," whispered Lucy to Susan, "what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was?" "Hush, no, of course not," said Susan. "Oughtn't he be told?" said Lucy. "Oh, surely not," said Susan. "It would be too awful for him. Think how you'd feel if you were he." "All the same, I think he ought to know," said Lucy. But at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for them all, I don't know. But somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine high tea at about 8 o'clock. Next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river, and the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them, and before them were the sand with rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed, and the smell of the sea and long miles of bluish-green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls. Have you heard it? Can you remember? That evening after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But next day was more solemn. For then in the great hall of Cair Paravel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof and the west wall hung with peacock's feathers, and the eastern door which looks towards the sea, in the presence of all their friends and to the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them and led them to the 4 thrones amid deafening shouts of "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" Once a king or queen in Narnia, always a king or queen. "Bear it well, sons of Adam, bear it well, daughters of Eve," said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of the mermen and the mermaids swimming close to the shore and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and scepters were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends, to Tumnus the fawn, and to the beavers, and giant Rumblebuffin, to the leopards, and the good centaurs, and the good dwarfs, and to the lion. And that night there was a great feast in Cair Paravel, and revelry and dancing, and gold flashed, and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside, but stranger, sweeter, and more piercing, came the music of the sea people. But amid all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away, and when the king and queens noticed that he wasn't there, they said nothing about it. For Mr. Beaver had warned them. "He'll be coming and going," he had said. "One day you'll see him, and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in, only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know, not like a tame lion." And now, as you see, this story is nearly, but not quite, at an end. These 2 kings and 2 queens governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first much of their time was spent in seeking out the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them, and indeed for a long time there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest, a haunting here and a killing there, a glimpse of a werewolf one month and a rumor of a hag the next. But in the end all that foul brood was stamped out. And they made good laws, and kept the peace, and saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, and liberated young dwarfs and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers, and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite a different sort from giant Rumblebuffin, on the north of Narnia when these ventured across the frontier. And they entered into friendship and alliance with countries beyond the sea, and paid them visits of state, and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as years passed over them, and Peter became a tall and deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors asking for her hand in marriage, and she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great in counsel and judgment. He was called King Edmund the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden-haired, and all princes in those parts desired her to be their queen, and her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. So they lived in great joy, and if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year it fell out that Tumnus, who was middle-aged fawn by now and beginning to be stout, came down river and brought them news that the white stag had once more appeared in his parts. The white stag who would give you wishes if you caught him. So these 2 kings and 2 queens, with the principal members of their court, rode a hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag. And they had not hunted long before they had a sight of him. And he led them a great pace over rough and smooth and through thick and thin, till the horses of all the courtiers were tired out, and only these 4 were still following. And they saw the stag enter into a thicket where their horses could not follow. Then said King Peter, for they talked in quite a different style now, having been kings and queens for so long, "Fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses, and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I never hunted a nobler quarry." "Sir," said the others, "even so, let us do." So they alighted, and tied their horses to trees, and went on into the thick wood on foot. And as soon as they entered it, Queen Susan said, "Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to see a tree of iron." "Madame," said King Edmund, "if you look well upon it, you shall see it is a pillar of iron, with a lantern set on the top thereof." "By a lion's mane, a strange device," said King Peter, "to set a lantern here where the trees cluster so thick about it and so high above it that if it were lit it should give light to no man." "Sir," said Queen Lucy, "by likelihood when this post and this lamp were set here, there were smaller trees in the place, or fewer, or none. For this is a young wood, and the iron post is old." And they stood looking upon it. Then said King Egmont, "I know not how it is, but this lamp on the post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen the like before, as it were in a dream, or in the dream of a dream." "Sir," answered they all, "it is even so with us also." "And more," said Queen Lucy, "for it will not go out of my mind that if we pass this post and lantern, either we shall find a strange adventure, or else some great change of our fortunes." "Madame," said King Egmont, "the like foreboding stirreth my heart also." "And in mine, fair brother," said King Peter. "And in mine too," said Queen Susan. "Wherefore, by my counsel, we shall lightly return to our horses and follow this white stag no further." "Madame," said King Peter, "therein I pray thee to have me excused, for never since we four were kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hands to any high matter as battles, quests, feats of arms, acts of justice, and the like, and then given over, but always what we have taken in hand, the same we have achieved." "Sister," said Queen Lucy, "my royal brother speaks rightly, and it seems to me we should be shamed if for any fearing or foreboding we turned back from following so noble a beast as now we have in chase." "And so say I," said King Edmund, "and I have such desire to find the signification of this thing that I would not by my good will turn back for the richest jewel in all Narnia and all the islands." "Then, in the name of Aslan," said Queen Susan, "if ye will all have it so, let us go on and take the adventure that shall fall to us." So these kings and queens entered the thicket, and before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered that the thing they had seen was called a lamp-post, and before they had gone 20 more, they noticed that they were making their way not through branches, but through coats. And next moment they all came tumbling out of a wardrobe door into the empty room, and they were no longer kings and queens in their hunting array, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy in their old clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of the day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they never came into the empty room, and so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story, if it hadn't been that they felt they really must explain to the professor why 4 of the coats out of this wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but believed the whole story. "No," he said, "I don't think it will be any good trying to go back through the wardrobe drawer to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route, nor would the coats be much use by now if you did." "Eh? What's that?" "Yes, of course you'll get back to Narnia again some day. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Indeed, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone, unless you find that they've had adventures of the same sort themselves." "What's that? How will you know?" "Oh, you'll know all right. Odd things they say. Even their looks will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools? And that is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. The end. That was a pretty good story, wasn't it? I really liked it. I had fun reading it to you. I hope you had fun listening to it. And I was thinking that this story reminds me of another story, of a very similar story. And it all starts pretty soon at Christmas time. At Christmas time, when we celebrate Santa Claus and gifts and all of those kinds of things, we also know that Christmas is really the time when we celebrate the birthday of Jesus, who is God's Son, who came as a baby in a manger to be with us. And when Jesus grew to be a man, Jesus was much like Aslan. Jesus cared for the people, wanted to make sure that they were healed from whatever was making them sick or holding them in place like a statue. And when they were hungry, he sat them down on the grass and he fed thousands of people with just a very little bit, just like Aslan fed thousands of people at the end of the story. And because Jesus came and stood for love and stood against all the things that make people divide one another, just like in our world when we have hate in our world, all of those things Jesus stood against. And Jesus stood against all the powers of greed and the rich and the powerful who would take everything for themselves, and then that would leave people going hungry and people left on the outside and people who were told that they don't belong. We have lots of those kinds of things going on in our world right now, don't we? People who say other people don't belong because of the color of their skin, or people who get really, really rich and don't care that other people are hungry and thirsty and don't have anything to eat. Well, Jesus came to make right all of those things, to make sure that everybody would be fed and be healed and to be welcomed as a child. And because Jesus did those things, Jesus was crucified, which means they nailed him to a cross, and he hung there to die for the sake of our world, for the sake of God's love for all of us. And just like Aslan, it sounds like it's the end of the story, and it is very sad. And they laid Jesus in a tomb that's like a cave, and in that cave was a stone that they laid his body on, kind of like the stone table. And then they rolled the stone in front of the door so nobody could get in. And now we move into Easter, which we think is about Easter bunnies and candy and egg hunts. And it is kind of about that, and that's the fun stuff. But it's also about Jesus rising again, just like Aslan did. And so when his friends, when the women came on Easter morning to the tomb, and they thought that they would prepare his body with spices and oils, and they came and they found that the stone was rolled away and that Jesus wasn't there, and that Jesus was risen from the dead, just like Aslan. And Aslan went away, and Jesus has gone away too right now, but has promised to come back. And in the meantime, we have God's Holy Spirit in us that reminds us about Jesus and teaches us about love and works healing and life in our world just the same. And so when we think about the Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe and the story of Aslan being killed because of love, and in the place of Edmund, and then rising again and bringing healing and life to everybody. That's the story of Jesus, and it's the story of Easter. And I hope that you think about that story too. But now we are done. No more chapters coming. We'll find something else to read. We'll do a craft. We'll do some baking again. But in the meanwhile, know that this grandma loves you very much. And I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.